first book that I'm going to do a book talk on is Titanic, Voices from the Disaster by Deborah Hopkinson. Everyone knows the story of the sinking of the Titanic, the striking of the giant iceberg. The women and children were saved first, and that it was a great tragedy. However, there are many more details that go unnoticed and unmentioned in many accounts of this infamous story. For example, everyone knows that women and children were saved first, but what many people may not know is how many women and children still perished in the lower classes because they couldn't figure out how to get to the upper decks and board a lifeboat from the lower decks. It took time for stewards to organize groups of women and children to take up to the lifeboats, and even longer to navigate the passages and stairwells to get them there. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m., but it wasn't until 12:30 that they were even allowed to go to the upper decks. At 1:40 a.m., the stewards were told to get into the lifeboats with the groups that they brought up to row them away from the ship, leaving no time to bring up any more third-class passengers. In addition to being further away from the lifeboats than any other class, there was also a language barrier that prevented many third-class passengers from understanding exactly what was going on, how to follow instructions given by the crew. There were also a number of gates, some locked even, between the third-class levels and the upper decks that prevented passengers from getting to the lifeboats, and the general atmosphere of confusion and chaos prevented stewards from even giving clear instructions when the third-class passengers were accustomed to wait for, through regulation and practice. More third-class passengers perished than any other classes, and of these, 524 of them were women and children. Another little-known fact that only appears in some information sources is that while the Carpathia was the ship that received and heeded the Titanic's distress call and made it to the site of the sinking to pick up survivors in the lifeboats, there was actually another ship called the Californian that could have made it there in half the time and probably before the Titanic sank, and possibly saved many more passengers. When Titanic shot off their first distress signal rockets, the crew of the Californian saw them and presumed that they were not distress signals. One was even reported to the captain, who woke up from sleeping, wondered if they were some kind of company private signals, and before going back to sleep gave instructions to the officers on duty to continue to try to make contact through Morse code, but not even to wake the telegraph officers. As the officers continued to see the rocket signals, they watched the lights of the Titanic disappear slowly, thinking that it was sailing away in the distance, when really, as we all know, it was sinking. These are just two of the many stories that we may or may not have heard in the many reports of the history of the Titanic. This book not only contains many of these stories that the reader may not have heard, but also stories, quotes, and thoughts from the passengers themselves fill the pages of the book, bringing the reader onto the decks of the Titanic, into the frigid waters, and into the lifeboats on that fateful day, April 15th, 1912. The second book is Flesh and Blood So Cheap, The Triangle Fire and Its Legacy by Albert Marin. It is 4:40 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon in March. Men and young women alike are finishing up a long work week, looking forward to their Sundays off, visiting with family, going on dates, and to dances or Nickelodeons. Little did they know that in just a few moments a fire would break out, that in only 35 minutes would swarm through 3 floors and take the lives of over 100 of the workers, mostly young girls and women. The extreme loss of life in this incident was due to a number of factors, of which this event caused major changes in the future to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. One of the most shocking factors was that the door leading to the 9th floor workroom was actually locked, essentially trapping all of the workers inside and preventing them from escaping through the stairwells or elevators. This was a common practice of the time to prevent workers from coming in late or leaving early. However, it was a death sentence for many of the workers when the fire broke out. Lack of fire drills and overhead ceiling sprinklers could also have been a factor, leaving the building with, in essence, very limited fire safety precautions. The more precautions that were in place, the less amount of money insurance brokers could make if a building could be considered safer due to all of these elements. Factory owners also had the potential of losing money with added safety precautions. The possibility of fires could prevent owners from losing money from unsold garments at the end of a season, where instead they could make that money back from insurance claims if the building accidentally caught fire. Sprinklers cost more money to install, and fire drills took time away from work, which in the end could amount to money lost on work time lost. So no fire drills had ever been conducted, and therefore from the instant that the fire broke out, confusion and chaos ensued. Due to the highly flammable clothing materials used in making the products the factory created and cans of oil that helped the sewing machines run smoothly, the entire room seemed in an instant to burst into flames. The New York Fire Department fire chief that did the inspection of the building after the fire was extinguished said in his own words he was utterly staggered by what he saw. The remainder of bodies burned down to bare bones and skeletons still bending over their sewing machines. A sign of so many caught in a fire so fast and furious, with no safety precautions set up for them, or knowledge of what to do, that their lives were taken before some of them even had a chance to make a run for it. What was learned by the horrific events that occurred in the factory that day, and how many lives have been saved from similar events happening again because of changes that were enforced in fire safety precautions due to the lives lost that day. This is a story of sadness and tragedy, but also of heroes and advocates for better working conditions who have brought us in part to where we are today. Imagine being locked in your workspace from the time you clock in until the time you clock out to ensure you don't come in late or leave early. Working 13 or more hour days and being watched on your breaks to ensure that you don't take more time than is absolutely necessary. And being charged out of your own pay if you talk, laugh, or sing, because these were indicative of wasting time at work. This is the story of people generations before us who paved the way for the freedoms we enjoy at work today, and people who paid the ultimate price so that their fates would not happen again. Finally, I have Wheels of Change, How Women Rode the Bicycle to Freedom with a Few Flat Tires Along the Way, by Sue Macy. As with the women who advocated for safer and more humane working conditions in Flesh and Blood So Cheap, women also advocated for rights and freedoms in Wheels of Change, How Women Rode the Bicycle to Freedom. Can you imagine riding a bicycle with pedals on the same side and being forced to ride this way because it was considered more ladylike than straddling a bicycle? Or when you do get to ride a bike with pedals on both sides, being forced to wear ankle-length skirts and 20 pounds of undergarments at all times while you are doing it? This doesn't sound very pleasant at all, and I'm sure it wasn't to the women in the late 1800s and early 1900s who were forced to actually do it. Women endured mockery and criticism worldwide for these rights they fought so hard to earn. Articles in newspapers complained about women losing their femininity as they wanted to switch out dresses and long skirts for loose divided pants that appeared to be a skirt to enable safer and more enjoyable abilities to ride the bicycle. A model of a woman riding a bicycle was even hung from a building in anger when a Cambridge university allowed full admission of women to their university. This book is the story of the brave and persevering women who stood up for women's rights and independence in a world where they were still extremely limited in so many ways. Not only does this book cover the history of women's freedoms granted through the bicycle, but also much about the bicycle itself. It includes pictures of some of the earliest forms of bicycles, including one called a hobby horse that had no pedals but required the rider to use their feet pushing along the ground to move the bicycle. Another that weighed as much as 150 pounds, had iron wheels, and had one ineffective spring under the seat that with all the features combined made the ride so rough that it earned the name Bone Shaker. Bicycle riding and eventually racing allowed women to step forward in society and enjoy more freedoms than they had previously been able to enjoy before the days of the bicycle. Politicians, soldiers, business leaders, and almost all athletes in popular sporting events of the time, including baseball and football, were made up of men. But this book shows how the bicycle brought women into the forefront and gave them an identity all their own, through racing and with the bicycle itself. This book is another account of the boldness and bravery of a multitude of women that lived and breathed a century before we did, and simply wanted what we all would today, to be themselves and enjoy the freedom to do so, and had the resolve and willpower to fight for it.